A touching story of Tommy, a 12-year-old orphan living on the outskirts of a small town in Montana, who encounters a mysterious Native American girl crying by the river. When he shares his only meal with her, he unknowingly sets in motion an ancient prophecy that will change his life forever. As 7 tribes converge at sunrise, Tommy discovers that his act of kindness has awakened something sacred, connecting him to a heritage he never knew existed and a destiny that will transform not only his own life, but the lives of everyone around him. Tommy's stomach growled so loudly that Mrs. Henderson looked up from her knitting with that familiar frown. He pressed his hand against his belly, hoping to muffle the sound. But hunger had a way of making itself known no matter how hard you tried to hide it. "There's leftover cornbread in the kitchen," she said, without looking at him again. "But that's all until tomorrow." He nodded even though she wasn't watching. Mrs. Henderson had taken him in 3 months ago when the state ran out of foster homes, but Tommy knew he wasn't really wanted here. He was just another mouth to feed, another burden in a house that already creaked under the weight of too many responsibilities. The cornbread was dry and crumbly, probably 2 days old, but Tommy wrapped it carefully in a piece of cloth anyway. It was all he had, and in his 12 years of life he'd learned that sometimes all you had was enough. You just had to know when to share it. The late afternoon sun painted the Montana sky in shades of orange and pink as Tommy walked toward the river. This had become his routine when the house felt too small and Mrs. Henderson's sighs grew too heavy. He'd take whatever food he could find and head to the water. There, sitting on the fallen log that had become his thinking spot, he could pretend he had somewhere to belong. The sound reached him before he saw her, soft crying that seemed to blend with the gentle rush of the river. Tommy stopped, his hand tightening around the wrapped cornbread. Someone else had found his secret place. She sat with her back to him, long black hair falling like a curtain over her shoulders. She couldn't have been much older than him, maybe 13 or 14, but there was something about the way she held herself that seemed both fragile and strong at the same time. Her clothes were different, not the jeans and t-shirts everyone wore in town, but a dress that looked handmade, with intricate patterns that caught the dying light. Tommy stood there for a long moment, unsure what to do. Part of him wanted to turn around and leave her to her privacy. But the sound of her crying tugged at something deep in his chest, a recognition of pain that he knew all too well. "Are you okay?" he finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. She turned, and Tommy felt his breath catch. Her face was streaked with tears, but her eyes, dark brown and filled with a sadness that seemed older than her years, held his gaze with an intensity that made him feel like she was looking right through him. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice carrying a slight accent he couldn't place. "I didn't know anyone else came here." "It's okay," Tommy said quickly, taking a step closer. "I mean, it's not really my place or anything. I just come here sometimes when I need to think." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, leaving streaks in the dirt on her cheeks. "My grandmother says the river knows all our sorrows. She says if you sit by the water long enough, it will carry your pain away." Tommy sat down on the ground a few feet away from her, not wanting to intrude but not wanting to leave either. "Is it working?" A small, sad smile crossed her face. "Not yet." They sat in silence for a while, watching the water flow past. The sun was getting lower now, and Tommy knew Mrs. Henderson would expect him back soon. But something about this girl, about the way she seemed to understand sadness the same way he did, made him want to stay. "I'm Tommy," he said eventually. "Ayana," she replied. "It means eternal blossom in my language." "That's beautiful," Tommy said, and he meant it. He'd never heard a name like that before. Ayana's eyes filled with fresh tears. "My grandmother gave me that name. She said I was meant to bloom even in the hardest ground." She looked down at her hands. "But I don't feel like blooming right now. I feel like everything is ending." Tommy didn't know what to say to that. He'd felt the same way so many times, like the world was ending and he was just waiting for someone to notice. Instead of words, he reached into his pocket and pulled out the wrapped cornbread. "Here," he said, holding it out to her. "I know it's not much, but, well, sometimes when everything feels like it's ending, eating something helps, even if it's just a little bit." Ayana stared at the offered food, her eyes widening. "But don't you need it?" Tommy shrugged, trying to look casual even though his stomach was cramping with hunger. "I can get more. Besides, my mom always used to say that food tastes better when you share it." It was a lie. He barely remembered his mother, and Mrs. Henderson certainly never said anything like that. But something about Ayana made him want to be the kind of person who had a mother who said wise things about sharing. She took the cornbread with trembling hands, unwrapping it carefully, as if it were made of gold. When she took her first bite, she closed her eyes and a single tear rolled down her cheek. "Thank you," she whispered. "You have no idea what this means." But Tommy thought maybe he did know. He knew what it felt like to be hungry and alone. He knew what it felt like when someone, anyone, showed you a moment of kindness. "What's wrong?" he asked gently. "I mean, you don't have to tell me, but sometimes it helps to talk." Ayana was quiet for so long that Tommy thought she wasn't going to answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was so soft he had to lean closer to hear her. "My people, we've been waiting for something. A sign." She looked up at him, her dark eyes searching his face. "My grandmother, she's been having dreams. She says a time of great change is coming, and that we need to be ready. But I'm scared, Tommy. What if I'm not strong enough for what's coming?" The way she said his name sent a shiver down his spine. It sounded different in her voice, like it meant something more than just a name. "I think you're stronger than you know," Tommy said, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. "I mean, you're sitting here by the river dealing with whatever's hurting you. That takes strength." Ayana smiled then, the first real smile he'd seen from her. "My grandmother would like you, I think. She always says that wisdom can come from the most unexpected places." The sun was almost gone now, painting the sky in deeper shades of purple and gold. Tommy knew he should go, but something about this moment felt important, like it was a page in a book that he needed to remember. "Will I see you again?" he asked as they both stood up. "I think so," Ayana said, but there was something in her voice that sounded like she knew more than she was saying. "Thank you for the bread, Tommy, and for seeing me." She walked away then, disappearing into the gathering darkness like she had never been there at all. Tommy stood by the river for a long time after she was gone, replaying their conversation in his mind. There had been something almost magical about her, something that made him feel like his small act of sharing had set something larger into motion. As he finally turned to head back to Mrs. Henderson's house, Tommy didn't notice the way the stars seemed brighter than usual, or how the wind carried voices speaking in languages he didn't understand. He didn't see the figures watching from the distant hills, or the way the river seemed to glow with its own light. But he felt it, a stirring in his chest, a sense that his life was about to change in ways he couldn't imagine. The lonely orphan boy who had shared his last piece of cornbread with a crying girl had no idea that by sunrise, 7 tribes would arrive on horseback, and nothing would ever be the same again. Tommy barely slept that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Ayana's face, the way her tears had caught the dying light, the grateful way she'd held his simple offering of cornbread. But it wasn't just her image that kept him awake. It was the feeling that something had shifted in the world around him, like a door had been opened that couldn't be closed again. Mrs. Henderson's old farmhouse creaked and settled in the darkness, but tonight, the familiar sounds seemed different. Between the groaning of old wood and the whistle of wind through the gaps in the windows, Tommy could swear he heard something else, voices speaking in low, urgent tones in a language he didn't recognize. He sat up in the narrow bed, pressing his ear against the thin wall that separated his small room from the outside world. The voices were clearer now, carried on the Montana wind like secrets being shared among old friends. They seemed to be coming from all directions, the hills to the north, the river to the east, even from the fields that stretched endlessly to the south. "Just the wind," he whispered to himself, but even as he said it, he knew it wasn't true. Tommy slipped out of bed and padded to the window, careful not to let the old floorboards creak under his weight. Mrs. Henderson was a light sleeper, and the last thing he needed was to wake her up with questions about why he was prowling around at midnight. The sight that greeted him outside made his breath catch in his throat. The usually empty hills around the Henderson farm were dotted with small fires, dozens of them, maybe more, flickering like fallen stars against the darkness. And silhouetted against those fires, he could see figures moving, people gathering in numbers that seemed impossible for this remote corner of Montana. As Tommy watched transfixed, one of the fires seemed to pulse brighter than the others. In that moment of increased light, he saw them clearly, horses and riders, more than he could count, arranged in careful formations across the landscape. They weren't moving toward the farmhouse, but they weren't leaving either. They were waiting. If this part is already stirring something inside you, tell me from which place in the world you're experiencing this story. I'd love to know where Tommy's journey is reaching you tonight. A gentle knock at his bedroom door made Tommy jump away from the window. His heart hammered in his chest as the door creaked open, but instead of Mrs. Henderson's irritated face, he saw something that made no sense at all. Ayana stood in his doorway, but she looked different now. Her handmade dress had been replaced by clothing that seemed to shimmer in the darkness. leather decorated with beads and silver that caught what little moonlight filtered through the window. Her long black hair was braided with feathers and small bones that made soft clicking sounds when she moved. "How did you get in here?" Tommy whispered. But even as he asked the question, he realized he already knew the answer wouldn't make sense. "The same way the wind gets in," Ayana said softly, "through the spaces between things." She stepped into his room and Tommy noticed that her feet made no sound against the old wooden floor. "You can see them, can't you? The fires on the hills?" Tommy nodded, not trusting his voice. "They're gathering because of you, Tommy, because of what you did by the river." "I don't understand," he said, his voice cracking with confusion and fear. "I just shared some cornbread, that's all." Ayana moved to stand beside him at the window, and when she looked out at the scattered fires, her expression was a mixture of wonder and something that looked like reverence. "My grandmother always told me that the spirits watch for moments of pure kindness," she said. "Not kindness given because someone expects something back or because it's the right thing to do, but kindness given simply because someone is in pain and you can't bear to see them hurt." She turned to look at Tommy, and in the moonlight streaming through the window, her eyes seemed to glow with their own light. "When you gave me your food tonight, you weren't thinking about being good or earning points in heaven. You just saw someone crying and wanted to help. That kind of kindness. It's rare, Tommy, rarer than gold or precious stones, and when it appears in the world, my people take notice." Tommy's mind was reeling. "Your people?" "7 tribes, Ayana said, gesturing toward the fires on the hills. 7 tribes that have been scattered to the 4 winds for more than a century. But the prophecies say that when a child of 2 worlds shows true compassion to one of the lost daughters, the time of gathering will begin." "Child of 2 worlds?" Tommy shook his head. "I don't know what that means. I'm just an orphan. I don't even know who my parents really were." Ayana smiled, and it was a smile filled with ancient knowledge. "Don't you feel it, Tommy? The way the wind speaks to you? The way the river called to you tonight? You've always known you were different, haven't you? That you belonged somewhere else, somewhere you'd never seen?" He had felt it. All his life, Tommy had carried a restlessness in his bones, a sense that he was searching for something he couldn't name. Even as a small child in the various foster homes and state facilities, he'd felt like he was waiting for someone to come and claim him, to tell him where he really belonged. "The 7th fire," Ayana continued, her voice taking on the cadence of someone reciting something sacred, "will be lit by one who carries the blood of the earth people and the sky people both. He will recognize suffering in all its forms, and his kindness will awaken the sleeping spirits of the 7 directions." A chill ran down Tommy's spine that had nothing to do with the cool night air. "You're talking about me. I'm talking about the boy who gave his last piece of bread to a stranger, even though his own stomach was empty," Ayana said. "I'm talking about the child who sees loneliness in others because he knows it so well himself." Outside the window, the fires on the hills began to move. Tommy watched in amazement as the distant lights started to form patterns, creating shapes against the darkness that looked almost like symbols or letters in a language made of flame. "They're getting ready," Ayana whispered. "At sunrise they'll come. 7 tribes that have been enemies for generations, all gathering because a 12-year-old boy shared his dinner with a crying girl." "But what do they want?" Tommy asked, his voice small and uncertain. "They want to welcome you home," Ayana said simply. "They want to show you who you really are." Mrs. Henderson's voice drifted up from downstairs, grumbling about something that had disturbed her sleep. Tommy looked toward his bedroom door, then back at the window where Ayana had been standing, but she was gone. The only sign that she had ever been there was the faint scent of sage and sweetgrass that lingered in the air. Tommy pressed his face against the window glass, watching the fires continue their slow dance across the hills. His whole life, he'd dreamed of someone coming to claim him, to tell him he belonged somewhere. But now that it was happening, he felt more scared than excited. What if they were wrong? What if he wasn't the person they thought he was? What if he disappointed them the way he seemed to disappoint everyone else? But even as these doubts circled through his mind, Tommy felt something else growing in his chest. Hope. For the first time in his 12 years of life, he was about to discover where he came from. And maybe, just maybe, he was about to find out where he belonged. The wind picked up outside his window, and this time Tommy didn't question the voices he heard carried on it. This time he listened, and he could swear they were singing his name. Dawn came like a whisper, painting the Montana sky in soft shades of pink and gold. Tommy had spent the remaining hours of the night pressed against his window, watching the fires on the hills slowly fade as the first light of day began to spread across the landscape. He must have dozed off at some point, because the next thing he knew, Mrs. Henderson was pounding on his door. "Tommy, get up! There's something there's—" Her voice trailed off, filled with a mixture of confusion and fear that made Tommy's stomach clench. He stumbled out of bed and threw open his door to find Mrs. Henderson standing in the hallway, her gray hair wild with sleep, her face pale as fresh milk. She was clutching her old bathrobe around her thin frame, and her hands were shaking. "Look out the front window," she whispered. "Just look." Tommy pushed past her and ran down the narrow stairs, his bare feet slapping against the cold wooden steps. When he reached the front room and looked out through the lace curtains that Mrs. Henderson kept pristinely clean, his knees nearly gave out. The empty fields that surrounded the Henderson farmhouse were no longer empty. As far as he could see in every direction, there were people, hundreds of them, maybe more. They sat on horses that looked like they had stepped out of old Western movies, their riders wearing clothing that spoke of traditions much older than anything Tommy had ever seen. But it wasn't just the sight of them that took his breath away. It was the way they were arranged. 7 distinct groups, he realized, each positioned at specific points around the farmhouse, like the points of a star. Each group was different. Some riders wore eagle feathers in their hair, others had painted their faces with symbols that seemed to shift and change in the morning light. Some carried staffs topped with animal skulls, others held shields decorated with intricate beadwork that caught the sunrise and threw it back in brilliant flashes of color. "Sweet Mary and Joseph?" Mrs. Henderson breathed from behind him. "What do they want? Should I call the sheriff?" Tommy couldn't answer. His throat felt like it was full of dust, and his heart was beating so fast he thought it might burst right out of his chest. This was really happening. Everything Ayanna had told him, everything about the prophecy and the gathering, it was all real. A movement in the center of the arrangement caught his eye. A single rider was approaching the house, moving slowly and deliberately across the morning damp grass. As the figure drew closer, Tommy could see it was an elderly woman, her long silver hair braided with what looked like pieces of turquoise and silver. She rode without a saddle, her back straight despite her obvious age, and there was something about the way she moved that commanded respect from every living thing around her. The woman stopped her horse just outside the front gate of Mrs. Henderson's property and raised one weathered hand. When she spoke, her voice carried clearly across the distance, strong and resonant despite her age. "We come seeking the boy who shares his bread with crying children," she called out. "We come seeking the one who recognizes pain and seeks to ease it, even when he himself carries sorrow." Mrs. Henderson grabbed Tommy's arm, her fingers digging in like claws. "What is she talking about? Tommy, what did you do?" But Tommy couldn't look away from the woman on the horse. There was something familiar about her, something that made his chest ache with a longing he couldn't name. And when their eyes met across the distance, he felt a jolt of recognition that went bone deep. "You know who I am," he whispered, and somehow he knew she could hear him. The woman nodded slowly. "I have been dreaming of you for 70 years, little one. Dreaming of the day when my granddaughter would find you by the sacred waters, when your kindness would awaken the sleeping prophecies of our people." "Your granddaughter?" Tommy's voice cracked on the words. "Ayanna of the Eternal Blossom," the woman said, and Tommy saw her then emerging from behind one of the groups of riders. She was dressed as she had been the night before, in the shimmering leather and beads, but in the daylight she looked even more otherworldly, like she had stepped out of a dream and into the waking world. "If you're feeling the same chills I'm feeling right now, I need to know, from which corner of our world are you witnessing this moment? Drop a comment and tell me where Tommy's story is touching your heart. I don't understand any of this," Mrs. Henderson said, but her voice had lost its sharp edge. Now she just sounded confused and frightened. "Tommy's just a boy. He's nobody special." The elderly woman's expression softened, and when she looked at Mrs. Henderson, there was nothing but kindness in her eyes. "Every child is special, grandmother, but this one carries the blood of the earth in his veins and the songs of the sky in his heart. He is the bridge between worlds that our prophecies foretold." Tommy felt like the ground was shifting beneath his feet. "What does that mean?" "It means," said a new voice, and Tommy turned to see a man approaching on foot from one of the other groups, "that you are not the orphan you believe yourself to be." The man was younger than the elderly woman, but still clearly an elder, his face marked with lines that spoke of years spent outdoors under the vast Montana sky. He wore a vest decorated with porcupine quills and carried a staff topped with a carved eagle. "Your mother," he continued, his voice gentle but firm, "was Singing Bird of the Northern Cheyenne. Your father was James Morrison, a white man who worked as a translator for the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Tommy's legs gave out then, and he sank down onto Mrs. Henderson's front steps. All his life he'd been told that his parents were unknown, that he'd been found abandoned as an infant with no clues about where he'd come from. They died in a car accident when you were barely 2 years old, the man continued. Your mother's family tried to claim you, but the state said you would be better off in their system being raised as a white child. They scattered you among foster homes and tried to erase your heritage. But heritage cannot be erased, the elderly woman added. It lives in the blood, in the bones, in the way a person sees the world. We have been searching for you for 10 years, following the guidance of dreams and signs. Mrs. Henderson sank down onto the step beside Tommy, her face pale with shock. All this time, she whispered, all this time you were looking for your family. Tommy felt tears streaming down his face, but for the first time in his life, they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of recognition, of pieces falling into place, of finally understanding why he had always felt like he was searching for something he couldn't name. The prophecy speaks of a time when the scattered tribes will gather again, Ayana said, stepping forward until she stood just on the other side of the fence. When the children of two worlds will help us remember what we have forgotten, help us heal what has been broken. And it all began, the elderly woman said, her voice filled with wonder, with a 12-year-old boy who couldn't bear to see a girl crying by the river. Tommy looked out at the 7 groups of riders, at the hundreds of people who had come from across the region to witness this moment. He thought about all the foster homes, all the nights he'd lain awake wondering where he belonged, all the times he'd felt like he was waiting for someone to come and claim him. What happens now? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The elderly woman smiled, and it was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. Now, grandson, you come home. The word hit Tommy like a physical blow. Grandson. He had a grandmother, he had a family, he had a place where he belonged. But as he looked back at Mrs. Henderson, sitting pale and shaken on her front steps, he realized that leaving wouldn't be as simple as just walking away. There were people here who had cared for him too in their own imperfect way. There was a life he'd built, small and uncertain as it was. He started, then stopped, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was being offered to him. The choice is yours, little one, his grandmother said gently. It always has been, but know that whatever you decide, you are not alone anymore. You never have to be alone again. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Tommy sat on those front steps and tried to decide between the only family he'd ever known and the family he'd been born to find. The silence stretched across the morning air like a held breath. Tommy could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes watching him, waiting for his decision, but strangely he didn't feel pressured. There was something about the presence of all these people, his people, he realized with a start, that felt patient and understanding, as if they had been waiting for him his whole life and could wait a little longer. Mrs. Henderson reached over and took his hand in her thin, weathered fingers. When he looked at her, he was surprised to see tears in her eyes. You know, she said quietly, her voice shaky but determined, I always wondered why you seemed different from the other foster children I've taken in over the years. You had this way of looking at things, like you could see more than the rest of us. And the way you talked to my old dog before he died last month, it was like you knew exactly what he needed to hear. Tommy squeezed her hand, remembering how he'd spent hours sitting with Rex in his final days, somehow knowing that the old border collie was afraid and needed comfort. You belong with them, Mrs. Henderson continued, nodding toward the assembled riders. I can see it in your face. You look like you're finally seeing yourself clearly for the first time. His grandmother urged her horse a few steps closer, close enough now that Tommy could see the intricate silver and turquoise jewelry she wore, the careful beadwork on her clothing, the wisdom lines around her dark eyes. There is no shame in having love for those who cared for you, she said, her voice gentle. Love is never wasted, grandson. The woman who gave you shelter when you had none, who fed you when you were hungry, she will always be part of your story. Tommy felt something loosen in his chest. He'd been thinking about this as a choice between 2 different families, but maybe it didn't have to be an either-or decision. Mrs. Henderson, he said, turning to look at the woman who had taken him in when no one else would. Would you like to meet my grandmother? The elderly woman on the horse smiled, and Tommy saw where Ayana had gotten her beautiful smile. I would be honored to meet the grandmother who raised my grandson with such kindness. What happened next was something Tommy would remember for the rest of his life. Mrs. Henderson, still in her bathrobe and slippers, walked out to meet the Cheyenne elder. The 2 old women looked at each other for a long moment, and then his grandmother slid down from her horse with surprising grace. They embraced right there in the morning sunlight. Two grandmothers from completely different worlds, united by their love for the same boy. "Thank you," Tommy heard his grandmother whisper. "Thank you for keeping him safe until we could find him." "He's a good boy," Mrs. Henderson replied, her voice thick with emotion. "The best I've ever known." Tommy felt his eyes fill with tears again, but this time they were tears of overwhelming gratitude. He wasn't losing anything, he was gaining everything. Ayana appeared at his side as if she had materialized from the morning air. "Are you ready?" she asked softly. Tommy looked out at the 7 groups of riders, at the faces watching him with expressions of hope and welcome. He thought about all the nights he'd lain awake wondering where he came from, all the times he'd felt like he was searching for something he couldn't name. "I've been ready my whole life," he said, and he meant it. His grandmother remounted her horse and extended her hand down to him. "Then come, Tommy Morrison, son of Singing Bird, grandson of the wind and the earth. Come and meet your people." Tommy took her hand and felt himself lifted up behind her on the horse. As they began to move toward the center of the arrangement of riders, something extraordinary happened. Each of the 7 groups began to sing, different songs in different languages, but somehow they all harmonized together, creating a sound that seemed to make the very air vibrate with power. If you want to keep hearing stories like this, stories that remind us what it means to find where we belong, tap that subscribe button now. It's free, and it means you'll be with me for every new journey we take together. As they rode through the assembled tribes, Tommy saw faces that looked like his own. The same dark hair, the same eyes that seemed to hold secrets, the same expression of quiet strength that he'd seen in his own reflection without understanding what it meant. These people were his heritage, his history, his home. But more than that, he began to understand what Ayana had meant about the prophecy. As they moved through the gathering, he could feel something changing in the air around them. The tension that had existed between the different tribal groups, rivalries and old hurts that went back generations, seemed to be melting away in the presence of something larger than all of them. "You see it, don't you?" his grandmother murmured in his ear. "The healing that your act of kindness has begun?" Tommy did see it. He could see it in the way riders from different tribes were nodding to each other with respect instead of suspicion. He could see it in the children from various groups who were playing together at the edges of the gathering. He could see it in the elders who were speaking to each other in low, excited voices, planning gatherings and celebrations that would bring their people together in ways that hadn't happened in over a century. All because a lonely boy had shared his cornbread with a crying girl. They reached the center of the gathering, and his grandmother helped him slide down from the horse. As his feet touched the ground, Tommy felt something he'd never experienced before, the absolute certainty that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Ayana stepped forward and placed something in his hands. It was a small pouch made of soft leather, decorated with beads and feathers. "This belonged to your mother," she said. "My grandmother has been keeping it safe, waiting for the day when she could give it to you." Tommy opened the pouch with trembling fingers. Inside was a photograph of a young Native American woman with his eyes and his smile, standing beside a tall white man with gentle features. On the back, in faded ink, someone had written, "Singing Bird and James Morrison, married in the sight of earth and sky, June 1985. They loved each other very much," his grandmother said, "and they would be so proud of the man you're becoming." Tommy looked up at the circle of faces surrounding him. His grandmother, Ayana, the elders from 7 different tribes, and in the distance, Mrs. Henderson watching with tears streaming down her cheeks and a smile on her face. For 12 years he had been Tommy the orphan, Tommy the foster kid, Tommy the boy who didn't belong anywhere. But as the morning sun climbed higher over the Montana hills and the voices of his people rose in songs of welcome and celebration, Tommy Morrison understood that he had never been alone. He had been on a journey to find exactly this moment, this place, these people, and his simple act of sharing food with someone in pain had been the key that unlocked everything he'd been searching for. What comes next in Tommy's story is even more incredible. His journey to learn the old ways, to understand his gifts, to help heal the wounds between the tribes, and to ensure you don't miss a single moment of stories like this that celebrate the power of kindness and the importance of finding where we belong. Make sure you're subscribed. These stories need witnesses, need people who believe in the magic that happens when we choose compassion over indifference. The gathering lasted 3 days. 7 tribes that had been scattered and separated came together to celebrate the return of a lost son and to begin the work of healing that his act of kindness had made possible. And Tommy, no longer an orphan, no longer searching, finally understood what home really meant. It wasn't a place. It was the moment when you realize you've been loved all along, even when you couldn't see it. It was the understanding that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can change not just one life, but the destiny of entire peoples. And it all began with a boy who couldn't bear to see someone cry, and who chose to share what little he had rather than keep it for himself.